Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to do a little strategic editing. I said in the video on global editing that we all see things differently as we look at images. Not only that, but we tend to notice more over time as our skill levels increase. So whereas global editing may meet our needs right now, perhaps in a few months or a year's time it may not, because our appreciation, knowledge and skill levels have improved. Now, towards the end of the video on global editing, I did hint that I could see one or two strategic edits in the image I've currently got highlighted. Now, let's remember that when I double click this to open it up, it's going to open up in Camera Raw, and Camera Raw is going to also remember all of the edits we previously did. So this is exactly where we were when we left global editing. Now I do want to cover strategic editing in a lot more detail as we go through the remainder of the videos. So here I'd just like to touch on a couple of simple strategic editing techniques just to join the dots up, so to speak. Now I think there's a couple of things I can see here that I'd like to address. I'd like to make some subtle adjustments to the colour in the image, but not globally. I want to do it strategically. Because if we look at the tail of the animal, it's quite strong in colour over here, and certainly the rocks are over in the middle left. Even the back foot of the animal is quite strong in colour too. What I'd like to do is maybe subdue the colour around these areas, but maybe enhance the colour just on the animal's head. To do that, I'm going to use an adjustment brush. In fact, I'm going to use two adjustment brushes. So I'd like to go up to the top left of the screen and select the brush I want. There's the tooltip there, adjustment brush, but just before I click the brush, if you'd like to look over to the right hand side as I do, you'll see a whole new set of sliders appear on the right hand side. And if I bring the brush over onto the right hand side, you can see the brush is made up of two circles. The inner circle is the solid part of the brush. The outer circle shows where it's completely transparent, so you've got a nice soft edge, what's called a feathered edge, and you can see a slider for that down at the bottom of that list. So we've got a nice soft brush with which to work. One of the things we need to remember when we're using strategic editing tools such as the adjustment brush, the graduated filter and the radial filter is that the settings we see over on the right hand side are always going to reflect the last settings we used. So we may have to bear that in mind whenever we select the brush or any of those filters, and we may also wish to reset them. Let me show you how we may do that. Now I want to subdue the colour in the background of this image. So to make a start, I'm just going to make a brush stroke over the tail of the animal, which is where I want to start to reduce the colour. As soon as I do that, you can see a pin is left behind. That pin is what turns on and off this particular brush. But once I've got the pin in place, I can move my brush right over it, right click, and I can reset all of those sliders on the right hand side. Now we don't have many that have been moved, but we could have a considerable number. So this is something I find myself doing quite often. I reset them and then I'm starting from scratch. But I do need to now decide what is it I want to do. Well, it's to reduce the saturation. So I'm going to go back over to the saturation slider on the right hand side and I'm going to drop it way down. Now I can come back and start brushing over the tail of the animal, and as I do that you'll start to see the colour reduced. Now I can do the same over the rock just behind the animal's face there. I'll drop the brush size down. There you can see I'm killing the colour there, and maybe even the strong greens in the back foot of the animal. Then over to the left hand side, I'll make my brush a bit bigger here to take quite a bit of colour from the rocks there, because that warm colour is going to attract our attention. Now there's obviously quite a few elements of this work which is going to be purely personal. There's a green little bit down there and down on the right hand side, but I think for the sake of this exercise we can say I've subdued the colour in the background where I feel that it needs to be subdued. So I've got it subdued in most places, but now I want to enhance it on the animal's face. Now to be able to do that, I need to create a new brush. Now if we go to the top of the adjustment brush settings on the right hand side, we've got a little box that we can just click, and you can see that the pin that we was currently using is now turned off, and if I mouse over it you can see all of the shading that I've done. What we're seeing here is the mask. Again, the mask is something you can turn on and off, and if you look down at the extreme bottom right of the screen you'll see a little box down there that says mask. So what I want to do is a little bit of work over the animal's face. I'll make my brush slightly smaller and I'll just brush to create the pin, because now rather than saturation removed I want saturation increased. And what I'd like to do over here is just improve the saturation just around the animal's head and maybe its front arms and feet. But there you can see I'm doing this pretty quick and dirty just to give you a flavour of what we've actually done. Subdued the colour in one area, lifted it in another, and of course the area I've lifted the colour is a pretty important point in the image itself. The next thing I'd like to do is to subdue the edges of my image, and I'm going to use the Radial Filter for that. I'm going to go up to the top of the screen to select it. Now when I do, I'm going to do a very quick and easy method to make an oval shape appear over the image. I'm just going to double click, and there you can see a bounding box. We're going to cover these tools in more detail a little later, so I don't want to dwell too much on this. But what we're going to do here is change what's outside of this particular bounding box. Now we can choose that by going down to the bottom of the settings here, and we've got an outside or inside of the shape. I want to affect what's outside. I want quite a nice strong feather. Probably I'll start around about 50. And another neat thing we can do with this is we can temporarily turn that off. Although it's turned off and out of our eye line, it's still working. We can either tick the box here, or we can touch the V key, V for Victor. A nice key which takes away lots of overlays on lots of tools within Adobe Camera Raw, and that makes it easier for us to see what we're about to do next, which is to go up to the exposure and just drop the exposure in the outer edges of the image. So once again we're forcing the focus onto the face of the animal just with a little bit of vignetting using that Radial Filter. And I think that's probably enough. We can open that up into Photoshop. Now, although the subject of this particular video is strategic editing, let me just finish this off with a fine tune. Because earlier on in one of the other videos I said editing is generally made up of 3 stages. Global editing that changes everything, strategic where we just attack one part or another as we've just demonstrated, and maybe there's a fine tune here and there. So sometimes when we open up an image like this we sit back and study the image, and even at this stage we suddenly see things that we may want to fix. No problem in going back into Camera Raw. Remember, our thumbnail will remember the changes we've made. But let's just make a couple of simple ones using the tools in Photoshop. I'm going to select my burn tool from the center of the toolbox, I've got Midtones selected from the top of the screen, which is the options for the tool, and I've got an exposure set of 10%. All I'm going to do is just darken down one or two of these areas. There's one there, just above the tail, maybe the back of the tail there, top right, midway down on the right hand side, maybe a little bit in the forefront of the rock that the animal's leaning against, just to take that down a little bit. In one or two other areas, just fine tuning to finish the job. So that's what I was referring to when I said small final touches. Now here's a great tip for your image editing if you've got the patience to do this. When you get your editing part the way done, let's say you've done the global editing and you've done some strategic editing too, you can open up the image and take a look at it in Photoshop, and you may even want to save it as a JPEG or a TIFF or a Photoshop file. If you can walk away for a few hours and come back later, maybe the next day, you'll often see your image in a slightly different light. So if you ended your manipulation after the strategic editing, you could quickly go back into Adobe Camera Raw to correct anything you saw overnight. But sometimes even when you just look at a picture on screen like this for a few minutes, you'll start to see things after a while. And I'm looking at my image here, and if I'm really looking for problems, there's just one or two little highlights I would still subdue. So I could go back to the same tool I had before, but this time when I select the burn tool, rather than selecting midtones at the top, I would select highlights. I'm going to leave the exposure at 10%. I'm going to bring my brush down to the back of the animal there, drop the size down just to subdue a little bit of highlights just around the background. These really are small little tweaks I'm doing here, but remember, when we talk about manipulation, we are talking about a number of small steps which add up to one big one.